Olá, sejam bem-vindos a mais um episódio de Isto Não É Assim Tão Simples, série da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos. Hoje o tema é a corrupção e para tentar desmontá-lo e explicar por que razão não é assim tão simples, vamos até a Itália para falar com uma das grandes peritas neste tema, Donatella Della Porta. A Donatella é professora de Ciências Políticas na Scuola Normale Superiore em Florença e tem dedicado grande parte da sua vida e da sua carreira profissional também a pesquisar os diferentes tipos de corrupção e o impacto que tem nos governos e nas empresas onde estão presentes. Portanto, penso que vai ser uma conversa muito interessante e vamos então começar a conversa com a Donatella. It's a pleasure to have you on the program, Donatella, and this is such an important topic throughout history, and especially now as well, when fortunately sometimes we feel we're getting some work done on dealing with corruption, and then other times it feels like corruption is getting the best of us. So let's start the conversation and an introductory question. Why is this topic, corruption, not that simple in your view?
There are several reasons, but the most important is corrupt politicians are often quite powerful, and so it is difficult to investigate. They tend to increase their power through corruptions. And additionally, this means that the more widespread corruption is, the least easy it is to investigate from the sides of judges and so on. So the power themselves of corruptions means that political institutions are transformed, checks and balances are weakened, and this also means for us as scholars that it is difficult to collect the reliable statistics. So either we have to rely upon impressions and reputations of the different countries, or we have to look inside the single cases in order to try to understand the rules of corruption and through this how much corruption is widespread.
Okay, perfect. So the stage is set for our discussion. I think it would be valuable for our viewers to break down a little bit the different types of corruption because it's a word that is so general. And obviously, you're an expert in this topic and have dedicated a lot of time to exploring it, to researching it. Can we break down the different kinds of corruption and where we find it present, whether it's with governments or in the private sector as well?
We usually consider corruption as an exchange of favor for money. One of the difficulties in comparative research is that different legal systems define corruptions in different ways. What also we found analyzing corruptions is that types of corruption can be very different. They can be very different in terms of the amount of resources. So we have petty corruption and we have grand corruption. They tend to be different in terms of the spreading. You can have occasional forms of corruption, but you can also have, and this is the one I've studied most, systematic forms of corruption, when corruption spreads in different systems. Differences about corruptions are also related with the moment in which it happens. So it can happen in the moment of a bid, when public officials decide who should get money, or it can happen also in the moment of controlling how money is used. But of course, it can be public, can be private, but I think one element is extremely interesting. So corruption is a crime that tends to remain quite hidden because it has often no direct victims. So what we found is that most of the firms who pay bribes have an interest in doing so. So they are not usually taking it out of their profits, but they develop collusive type of relationship with public administrators. This also implies that there is a network of corruptions that tend to spread, but that needs some forms of governance. And another difference that is relevant to understand is that forms of corruptions can change according to which actors intervene in order to implement the corrupt exchanges. So in the past, many forms of visible corruptions were steered or controlled through political parties or party bosses. But you can also have a corruption that is controlled, managed by firms, cartels of firms, for instance, is very common. You can have corruptions that is managed by mediators, brokers of different types, including organized crime. You can have also different forms of organizations according to all these differences. So it is also one of the difficulties in studying corruptions is that all these forms tend to have, at least in part, different causes and also different potential solutions. The type of interventions for investigating petty crimes is different than the ones that needs to be used when controlling grand corruption. And so it is important to understand the differences, but also then to see how the different forms are often related with one another.
Okay, that's clear. You've been obviously studying this topic for several decades. I have a question which goes into three different areas, but we'll try to break it down so it makes sense. The first is, do you think that throughout your life and career, the world has become more corrupt or less corrupt? Do you think enough processes, enough checks and balances are being worked on and put into place? And then as a final part to this question, do you think that the big challenge about studying and exposing corruption is that normally you're going up against very powerful people, as you touched on? So the danger that exists in trying to expose this corruption is actually quite high and can affect the success of exposing it.
Yes. So to answer to the questions, did I a reduction of corruptions? I would say, unfortunately, not. There was a moment in which, especially in Italy, after the so-called clean end investigations that exposed a huge amount of corruption and very systematic one in 1992 in Italy, that exposing corruption could produce a sort of renewal, reform of the system. But unfortunately, this was not true. What we saw was some changes in the main actors that regulated the corrupt exchange. So we saw that some parties became less powerful, but that more hidden actors became more powerful in these exchanges. For instance, there was less party corruption, but more corruption involving public administration. What I would also say is that recent change, the continuous series of crises that we have been living through since the beginning of the millennium, have developed conditions under which corruptions tend to spread. One of these elements is the so-called democratic backlash or democratic backsliding. Mm-hmm. So the reduction of democratic qualities in many states and reductions of the independence of the judiciary and of the independence of the press, which are important actors in controlling corruptions when they have the possibility to do so. Another type of changes that have indirectly favored corruptions have been related with the wave of deregulations and privatization of several public enterprises, which have reduced the capacity of the judges to investigate and have reduced the rules of the case. A third element that I think also affected an increase in corruption is the reduction of what has been called the retrenchment of the welfare state. Why so? Because retrenchment of social rights in many countries means citizens are weaker in demanding what should be their rights. And so they are more able, or they are pushed to pay for finding ways to get what they need. So I think that all these changes put together have implied less transparencies, less capacity to fight corruptions, and also made more difficult for the sets of actors that are usually important in order to control corruptions to intervene. And we see it in some developments like the presence of more and more oligarchic regimes, more and more people that, contrary-wise to what should happen in democracy, tend to accumulate political and economic power. We thought that only Italy and a few other developing countries had politicians like Silvio Berlusconi, that is, politicians that had at the same time large economic power and large political power, control on the press, and so on. But what we discovered with the series of scandals in many other countries was that this type of developments against previous expanding of democratic regimes, which meant more pluralistic elite, has instead produced a sort of oligarchy in which political and economic power tend to overlap.
Okay. Obviously, it makes sense, and I believe you mentioned this in your last answer as well, that the more democratic processes that exist and the more the power is shared, the greater the chances of dealing successfully with corruption. And the more autocratic a state is, the more threats there are. So my question is, how worried are you when many of the superpowers have quite autocratic states, whether it be China, whether it be Russia, whether it be India, whether it be Brazil? I mean, these are all very powerful nations, and we could add the United States a few years ago when we had Donald Trump there as well, right? So how worried are you, and what is the way to try to contain and control possible threats of corruption in these such powerful states?
Well, I'm worried.
Yeah.
In the sense that what we see is a trend in which sort of vicious cycle. The more corrupt institutional politics it is, the least is easy to mobilize counter resources, also in terms of honest politicians, widespread commitment to political institutions, and so on. Is what we saw also very clearly in Italy when the political class appears as corrupt. People tend to retreat from politics. Of course, there are moments in which there have been rebellions in the name of cleaning up the political class, cleaning up corrupt institutions. But in many cases, also the effect of discovering cases of corruptions is that people try to find a way to solve issues at the individual level. And what we saw is that this is in a sort of vicious cycles, as I mentioned, tend to increase the number of people that get into politics as a way to become richer rather than a way to serve public goods and so on. And all the cases you mentioned, including the United States, are cases in which, as in the 18th centuries, what we see is that money is important for politics and vice versa, and that people like Trump, like people like Berlusconi, come to politics not only with their own resources, but also with the intentions to draw from politics resources that can enrich them. And they come with a power that is also steered by their control on the media, which is particularly relevant. So how to address the issues is not easy because it implies the attempt to reconstitute public spheres. We have a lot of them. We have a lot of civil initiatives to, for instance, develop sort of monitoring of political institutions from below. We have seen a multiplication of this. We have seen a use of social media also to empower this type of control. But we have seen also the opposite. So each new instrument that can be used to control corruptions is an instrument that corrupt politicians can also use for their own advantage. And so I think that devising, singling out solutions for such a complex development of corrupt politics is also made difficult by the fact that we find more and more globalizations of corruptions, more and more development of intransparent type of institutions. If we think about financializations and offshore societies, and we think about scandals like the Panama Papers that told us how many countries had important politicians involved in this type of corrupt exchanges. We know that it is not something that can be addressed at the level of a single nation. It's a much broader global problem. And to find a solution to global problems is always difficult, especially in situations of hyper-marketization, privatizations, and faced to the weakness of international law. It is also an issue in many cases. Financializations and globalizations of corruptions meant that many cases that were discovered and pursued by judges at national level were stopped by the difficulties of investigating at transnational level.
I know that you've been quoted in various articles when discussing the exposure of some corrupt processes, and whether it be with Brazil or in the Operation Car Wash. And you talk about the importance of the judiciary really remaining independent and having an opportunity to be credible and not be influenced by anyone or anything. When you see certain cases of judges, lawyers being bought off in several countries or in several cultures, I did want to ask you about the motivations of whistleblowers, because if you talk about people who are researching and are then trying to expose corruptions, they think, okay, I have a huge risk here that I'm exposing myself when trying to blow the whistle on these corrupt processes. And then I know I'm right, I know I've got the facts, I know I've got the information, but then if nobody does anything with it, it's a lose-lose situation, right? So how do you describe this process of finding a corruption and then revealing it, and depending on a judiciary system that can then do its job and charge people?
This is a most delicate issue, in fact, because it links with what I was mentioning in the beginning. Corruption is a crime in which there is no direct, immediately visible victim. The victims are all of us because corruption make public services more expensive and decreases the qualities, but it is not like stealing when you are directly affected as a victim and so you denounce it. And this is also related with the fact that corruptions tend to be, when it is systematic, tend to penetrate entire areas of the public administrations, and so making the discovering from inside more and more difficult. It's not just a few corruption, but also often is entire departments that are corrupted, or entire sectors like sectors, the health system, and so on. And so in these cases, one needs to rely upon the occasional honest members of these institutions if to give hope to these persons, because, of course, you are more keen on taking risks if you think that someone will intervene in your favor. You need them, but you also need to make them sure that, or almost sure, that what they do at big sacrifice for themselves could be useful. And so I think it is a mix of individual and collective incentives that needs to be given. You need to protect the individual, but also to create civil society organizations, and there are several that can collect this alternative knowledge on crimes. And of course, the signals that we get are not all in this direction. So what I can say, I can call the big disillusions in Italy was after the scandals in 1992 emerged, the clean end investigations, there was an hope that the judges would be able to clean really up the system. But what became visible was that the power of the corrupt politicians is resilient. The power, I would say, of the corrupt system, because it is not only the politicians, it's also the private business, the firms that are in contact with them, and so on. So that's the independence of the judiciary is fundamental. But what we have to be aware of is also that some entering into political delicate exchanges by discovering corruptions, the judiciary sometimes become challenged, become politicized, and many of the attacks against the judiciary in Italy came not only from the corrupt politicians themselves, but from the political system in general, and it's delegitimized to a certain extent the judiciary. So what I want to address is also the fact that the judiciary alone cannot be sufficient. So what we saw in Italy was an independent judiciary that very courageously and very effectively pursued corruption, but a revolution by the judges, it was called at that time, cannot by itself reform a political system, because then you also need resources from inside the system in order not to give the impression that it is an internal fight between the power of the judiciary and the power of the politicians. So judiciary is important, but not sufficient. We need different type of processes intersecting with each other.
Final question for you before we get to our quick fire section. If I were an up-and-coming politician, and let's just say I'm in Italy, I'm Italian, because that is also your area of particular expertise, and you're Italian. What advice would you give me on how to stay clean?
Well, I think that for several of us, staying clean is not so difficult because when we don't have resources that corrupt politicians are interested in, we are to a certain extent not put in temptation, I would say.
Okay.
But on the other hand, it is true that as teachers, as journalists, as citizens, we are also often in front of dilemmas about corruption. For instance, we know that it is important that there is also an acknowledgement of the need to fight corruption also from below, also from the side of the citizens. And that's what we do is important in order to spread also the knowledge about the corrupt exchange, spreading the knowledge that corruption is not something, as it was thought in the past, that is just an instrument of modernizations and then we go away, that corruption is not a crime without victims, that we are all victims. So I think that civil courage is also needed at the normal citizens. The challenge is that often the informations that we are able to mobilize are insufficient for fighting corruption itself. So, for instance, to you personally, as a journalist, I would say, but I'm sure you know this already, what I found extremely useful in the functions of the press has been this capacity to build international network of investigative journalists that could collaborate in discovering a network of power, like with the Panama Papers, for instance, that in some cases were directly connected with corruptions, in other cases maybe not directly, but for sure indirectly very important for the spreading of corruptions. And going from this to general type of advice, I think important is to acknowledge that fighting corruptions need collective actions, so that it is not sufficient to take it as an individual duty, but it is also important to develop structures that could face this very powerful octopus that we saw quite widespread also in countries that we assume to be quite clean. About Iceland in 2008, where Iceland was at the top of the transparent countries, and with the financial crisis, what was discovered was that in reality there was a very strong, powerful nets of power composed of political parties, banks, and firms. And I think these all need collective type of responses.
Donatella, this has been a fascinating conversation. I have some final quick-fire questions that we ask all our guests, and I ask you for in one, it's okay, it's not going to hurt, in one word or in one sentence to try to answer these questions. So what is one personality trait that a good leader should benefit from having?
Well, talking about corruption, I'm sure that honesty is important, but I would say it is also the capacity to listen to others. And because, as I mentioned, corruption is not just a technical issue that can be solved through the institutions. You need also to involve the citizens. And for this, you need to listen to the knowledge of the citizens, sensitizing them.
Second one, what is the biggest challenge humanity faces today in your area and in your opinion? I think a main challenge is inequalities
growing inequalities affects also corruption because it is in a situations in which you have the super rich that are all very powerful, that give the impression that they dominate not only the political but also the economic system. That's, I think, corruption can spread. So inequality means less rights. Corruption develops when individuals do not have rights and have to look for protectors. And this is why I think inequalities is in a time of intertwined crisis, financial, health crisis, the climate crisis, inequalities is the main issues.
Very well. Two more quick answers. If you could change one thing in the world today, what would you choose?
Reduce inequalities, I would say, because I think that most issues are connected with this, and the ethical dimensions that favored corruptions is related with the increasing impressions that people as individuals do not have rights, that we have to follow the law of the market. I think we have to go back to more to states that are more capable also to intervene in favor of the citizens.
And the last one, what is the most important learning of your life?
That's difficult. I would say that's one important learning also about corruption is that it is knowledge is extremely important to fight corruption and to fight for a better societies, but that this knowledge is not just the academic knowledge, that we need to create spaces in which the knowledge of the academics, the knowledge of the judges, the knowledge of the journalists, but also the knowledge of the civil society fighting against corruptions, the knowledge of the citizens that face unjust institutions has to be put together. This I think, is one of the learning.
Donatella, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your insight, your experience, your expertise, and you definitely help explain why the topic of corruption is not that simple. All the best.
Thank you, Pedro. It was nice to talk to you.
Prazer falar com a Donatella, que nos explicou durante a última meia hora por que razão a corrupção não é assim tão simples. Até breve.